thank you to STM for inviting me here. This is always an opportunity. It's nice to see some of you again, see some familiar faces, and then to meet some new faces. And thank you to Access Innovations for sponsoring this event. So stewardship, it's something we all think we know about, something we all think we're responsible for, something that we all do, but gave me pause for thought when the title was given to me. And it took me a while to come up with my subtitle, which is The Imperative for Collaboration. Actually, at the end, I'll tell you what might have been a better subtitle. It might have caught your imagination a little bit more. But I do believe that stewardship, especially stewardship of the record of scholarly accomplishment, is not the responsibility of any single entity. I do believe we have to work collaboratively, and to work collaboratively, we have to take a broader look at what we're all doing. So, we can go to standard definitions of stewardship: the careful and responsible management of something entrusted to one's care, trusted to whose care, by whom, for what purpose. Responsibility reflected as both a value and a practice by individuals, organizations, communities, and competent authorities. And these are the standard definitions. What I see missing in these, that I think is an important aspect of stewardship, is some concept of added value, value add. If we don't participate in a value-added way, it seems to me we're collecting, storing. That's it. It's sort of a bit boring. So I think to do it a little bit more. I sort of created an organization a number of years ago called the Knowledge Trust, and in there we talked about trust, we talked about knowledge trust, we talked about trusted care of the knowledge environment, but we were particularly concerned with the stewardship of the knowledge professions, which is the other piece that I won't talk about today, but along with stewardship of knowledge has to come appropriate stewardship of the professions that will allow these knowledge ecosystems to thrive. And if we ignore the knowledge professions, some of which have become endangered in some respects, then we're not going to be able to go forward either. So that's just an aside for what I want to talk about today. But really, as we think about stewardship, I got to looking at stewardship of the environment, where there's a lot of things going on, and a lot of players, and a lot of different agendas. And then I went back in the literature, so always getting access to what's gone before, and started to look at the notions that indigenous peoples had and still try to have of the collective stewardship of the environment. And it seemed to me there were some elements in what the old traditional views of people's relationship with the environment that actually I think can be carried over into the knowledge ecosystem, although our understanding of ecosystems now are much, much more complex. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ecosystems and then apply it to our environment and talk about the way forward for us, and I'll end with a story. So, there are many different depictions of ecosystems, but they are complex. It's not just looking at species and how species survive. It's about what are the factors that change, what are the sort of unintended consequences of actions taken by one set of agents over another set of agents, how things have changed. We sort of marched across different countries, and progress was seen as, in creating communities and industrialization and deforestation. Not necessarily they said let's deforest, but let's clear the way, and with the net that there were negative effects on the overall ecosystem. And species die and are born, and in the knowledge environment we'd like to see our species stay alive. We'd like to have a sustainable environment, and working towards sustainability is very different from building an entity just to be in place. I always say building organizations in higher education is easy. Building sustainable organizations takes a very different approach. You have to build from the design for sustainability, and we have to think about ecosystems from the perspective of sustainability and progress, so that we have continued roles in this environment. So the ecosystem components, there are two components in ecosystems, broadly speaking: the abiotic, which are the non-living components, and the biotic, which are the living components, or the various living species. And the study of an ecosystem, then, is the study of the various processes that link the living and the non-living elements within within an ecosystem. And ecosystem stewardship, we really have to sort of sit above the ecosystem in a way and take a look at the whole and then understand how things interrelate within the ecosystem. If we look at the ecosystem from each individual perspective, we'll only get a piece of the picture. If we look at it from above as a whole system, then we can begin to see things like energy flows, material cycles, and various controls that are imposed on the ecosystem, either from the top down or from the bottom up. We can see and impose controls. We're seeing some of those right now, and again, I'll talk about those in a while. So if we think about the non-living components of the ecosystem, in the ecological ecosystem, we have the sun, we have temperature, precipitation. In the knowledge ecosystem, we have content. We have original sources, secondary sources. I understand those in and of themselves are complex definitions, but we have sources. At higher level compilations, grouped elements at the radiation levels, climate, or cataloged, edited higher level knowledge, libraries, metadata libraries, and even on the negative side, you have propaganda that's collated in ways. So those are kinds of systems. In the storage, in the ecological ecosystem, we're looking at elements that are stored in the environment, like minerals in the soil, to what extent do we maintain levels in the soil, radiation in the sun. In our world, in the knowledge world, we have containers of knowledge from people, cultural heritage, language art, printed word, visual images, data sets, etc. Distribution. How do we distribute energy within the ecosystem and minerals, etc.? Storms, we have the sun's rays, big storms coming here in the next couple of days. In the knowledge ecosystem, we have the spoken word. We started with language and storytelling, plays, visual knowledge, museums, printed word, books, journals, etc., all becoming much more complicated as more options become available. And in a way, we're not seeing a lot of things die in our world. One of the classic problems of the knowledge environment is to try and make available access to this ever-increasing body of recorded knowledge. We can't always do that, but we try to the extent that we can. And level and availability within the ecosystem, things vary from time to time, from area to area. Various changes occur, things that happen, well, let's see, in the educational environment, let's talk about the development of the European Union and the Bologna Agreement, which had significant impact in certain countries on their educational systems. Here we have the role of accreditation, and I'll talk about that as one of my concerns, the role of accreditation and how accreditation plays into how we articulate, value, recognize, and reward scholarship in higher education as part of the accreditation system. And so the bottom line is basically all abiotic components, the substance, the higher level collections, storage systems, distribution systems, have to continue to exist in some way, or the ecosystem becomes non-functional, and then species become extinct. So to the extent that we have interest, we look at all the species and decide if we want all of them to stay active, but otherwise they'll become extinct. So we need to know what the different elements are on the biotic side of things. In an ecosystem, we talk about functional groups of organisms. It's focused on function and not individual species. So they don't in ecosystems necessarily look at individual species, but functions or roles that organizations play. And so we have in the ecosystem, we have producers, solar energy shines on the earth, and we have trees and plants, and then we have animals of various kinds, and admittedly some animals are herbivores and some animals are carnivores, so some animals eat the herbivores, and then we play a role as humans. And then we have the role and function of decomposers, who in a way act as filters and filter some of the nutrients, if you like, back into the whole ecosystem. So there is an ecosystem cycle. And in our environment, we have producers, consumers, and decomposers. And our producers are the authors, our researchers and scholars, your authors, knowledge organizers, so catalogers, metadata creators, etc., funders of all kinds, validators, and colleges and universities give some level of validation through their accreditation. Belong to, if you go to one institution, it's looked at in a particular way. If you go to a different institution, it may not be publishers play many of those roles at all. So you're also producers in this system. As we look at consumers, we have readers. You're consuming content from the producers. Libraries have a role to play. They take content from you and from the producers, and we have authors and researchers also as consumers. And then we have decomposers, validators, funders, knowledge organizers, knowledge organizations, publishers, libraries, scholarly associations, and so on. In the ecosystem web, we look at a number of different relationships. So one could be looking at the feeding relationships among species within a community. So we could look at the fact that, the sun facilitates the growth of plants. Birds and insects consume the plants. Birds might consume some insects. Animals might consume some birds, but they continue to balance out in the ecosystem, and then nutrients are recycled through waste back into dead organisms and waste back into the physical environment. It's a one-way flow shown there. In the knowledge ecosystem, if we consider that we have producers, consumers, and decomposers, we start to look at the roles. And in this environment, for producers, we have the authors, the researchers, the scholars who are definitely key to the production end of this environment. The funders also play a role. Interesting things happening. I'll talk about the perturbations in just a minute. Funders play a role in determining, to some extent, not completely, but to some extent, what research is done through their process of what they fund, the programs that they fund, and the peer review process that they put in place. So there's a certain filtering there. But federal funders and states and local organizations, foundations, academic institutions themselves are all funders of scholarly work, scholarly research. I should say scholarly works, but it's not all research related, although your audience is primarily, in the STM environment, predominantly research-based. We have the knowledge organizers, so people who are organizing, collecting, adding value through indexing, collating, and establishing metadata for collections, are also producers of secondary information. Publishers are responsible for gathering that. You play some roles as funders, some roles as knowledge organizers, some role as validators, but you publish and distribute, and that's also a very important role. And we have the validators, which I've mentioned. And consumers, as I've said, readers are clearly consumers, authors and readers not the same group. I'll mention that in a minute. Consumers, researchers are consumers, but they're not the only consumers. Publishers consume the content and make it available. Libraries are consumers of the content that publishers and authors provide and make that available. And then the decomposers, peer reviewers are decomposers, and funders are decomposers. Publishers are decomposers by selecting what you will publish, even through peer review, and knowledge organizers. Now, what's interesting is you will notice I haven't put academic institutions in here yet, except as in this sort of validation role. But it used to be that, until fairly recently, the roles and responsibilities in these different areas were pretty clear-cut. We knew what they were. It functioned well. We didn't perturb the system. It worked well, and we were all happy. Certainly as academic institutions, we were generally happy. It worked. We knew how it worked. We knew what the rules were, and we played the game. What's happened now is that all of these roles and functions are changing in very, very different ways. So I want to spend a little time on that, so you can see all my thoughts in a rather haphazard way. And let me talk first of all about this from the perspective of academic institutions. So first of all, the pressures that we face as academic institutions are rising costs. We've all seen the headlines on rising costs. We're all trying to contain our costs, but we, in many instances, have deferred costs, so we haven't really taken care of things in the way we would normally if we'd had resources. Demographics are changing, so we are becoming concerned. We are seeing fewer and fewer high school graduates, particularly in certain parts of the country, particularly in New England, where I'm now based. We are seeing increasing numbers of students come from other parts of the world. And they've been able to fill in some of the gaps of the declining high school graduation rate in this country. But as other countries are building out their own educational and higher educational infrastructure, this is not going to last forever. So that we as academic institutions can't rely on the fact that we'll always have influxes of international students. And interestingly enough, I go twice a year to a meeting just around the corner from here with my counterparts from other institutions around the state. And we talk about the fact that every single person around the table, every academic affairs official, wants to increase the number of students at his or her institution at a time when we're already struggling just to maintain the students that we have at a time when costs are rising. So this is a dilemma for academic institutions. And so we haven't necessarily paid from the highest level of the institution as much attention on the scholarly communications environment as we probably should have and could have. We just didn't. We've been distracted by these other issues. We see other increased competition. Let me see, in the late 90s, I think there were around 3,500 institutions of higher education, colleges and universities in the United States. There are now over 4,000. There's increased competition. There's increased competition from private for-profit institutions. There's increased competition from community colleges that have implemented 2+2 programs with universities, but also are increasingly offering 4-year degrees at much, much lower costs. We've seen competition from the rise of the online programs, particularly online programs from accredited institutions. We have pressures from accrediting bodies who used to accredit, who are struggling, by the way, with the accreditation of libraries within the academic institution. And my own accrediting body, the Northeast Association, NEASC, was at one point struggling to put libraries and technology completely together. And I was one of the people that said, no, they're different. They relate to each other, but they are different. And so there is a role of the library that is not just technology-based. So to try and maintain clear distinction in how every element of an academic institution could be measured and contribute towards accreditation. And then we have policy and regulation at the state level and at the federal level. So we could talk about the mandate, as yet unfunded, for public access to peer-reviewed scholarly materials and data, with not a lot said in the directive about how we would do that, what it would cost, who would play what role, and also, what do we mean by access? For how long? For whom? Etc. That's sort of interesting questions to ask about mandates of that kind. Similarly, we saw with the stimulus money, the ARA money, much of that spending, when it went to higher education and research, was focused on funding new researchers. When you fund new researchers, you build an expectation. So they expanded the number of funded researchers in the United States. I'm only talking about the United States. But when the money went away, the remaining funds that actually were stable or went down because of the continuing resolutions in this country actually were not sufficient to maintain funding for the typical core of institutions and individual researchers that had been funded in the past. So there's a net dip in the availability of funding. Similarly, I've seen institutions all wanting to become research institutions. I am no longer at a research institution, I'm at a master's level institution. When we have a role, and our faculty are certainly active in research and publish quite extensively, but the research institutions are the ones where much of the federal research dollars are focused, and so it's very hard to break into that, and it's not going to happen over time. I think we as academic institutions have to understand that. So all of these were externalities that we have to be dealing with at a time when publishers are dealing with similar kinds of externalities. We've seen a lot of mergers and acquisitions in the publishing world. We've seen the role of technology in the publishing world. We've looked at the role of technology for all of us, quite frankly, as we've sort of democratized the availability of technology and access. And now we're no longer living in a world of scarce resources in terms of technology and content, but we're dealing with a very, very noisy world. And one of the issues we're going to have to deal with is how do we find our way through the noisy world? Different issue. The other concern that I've seen in higher education, and actually in some of the very excellent collaborations between the publishing community and higher education, and there have been many, many over the years, this is not new, I mean, it's been going on forever, is the dilemma that many of these initiatives don't always lead to something. And what I have observed is that the institutions that tend to be able to participate are the institutions that can afford to participate. And so you can work on solutions with institutions that can afford to participate, but there are many, many, and that's a few, there are many, many other institutions that cannot afford to participate. And so the dilemma in creating new solutions and new platforms and new ways of doing things is that if you don't have a critical mass of the base that you're trying to influence move in that direction, it tends to fall apart. So we get a lot of things that, sort of ideas that never quite came into full fruition. Lots of good research, but we never quite pushed it over the edge. Academic institutions suffered from this for a long time. And so I've been at some of the big ones, some of the largest, and there we were, the forefront, making things happen. But when we turned around, there were others who weren't able to move, and so we could only go so far. And I think that's a dilemma that we have to think about in the ecosystem. If we're looking at an ecosystem, we have to look at everybody who's part of that ecosystem. You can't leave a species out here to fend for itself, or a large number of other species to fend for themselves when we're moving off in a particular direction, because these are all interconnected in interesting ways. So the roles and functions are very muddy. So as an academic institution, I can say, well, we have many of your authors. We house libraries. We are funders in and of our own right, so we do fund research, and we fund sabbaticals, and we fund travel for faculty to go and disseminate information and gather information. We are funders also of the libraries, so as well as the individual faculty scholars. To some extent, we have some level of a sort of validation role as accredited entities. We house some of the readers, and we are, to some extent, some of us actually are publishers too. The publishers, you are also changing your roles. You've had a role in taking content. And by the way, I would say, here's one of my controversial statements, probably be pilloried for it, but I do believe that as academic institutions, we outsourced quality control function to the scholarly societies and the publishers. And we were quite happy with that. And I know there have been times in the past 10, 15 years when there have been discussions of, well, we'll do it ourselves as academic, we have the authors, we have the readers, we have libraries, so we can do this. But we can't. It's not our core mission. Distribution, dissemination is not our core mission in that sense. It is through education, but not more broadly. Although even that's getting fuzzy as expectations of academic institutions move from sort of a purely educational role into somewhat more of an economic, regional development role, although I like to make the case that education is economic development. Statement number 2, which is a good statement, and I hope economic developers would understand, and policymakers. We've seen publishers add roles. In fact, just recently we had the announcement of Pearson U. Okay, Pearson University, you're now always in the education business, usually with some of our audience and a broader audience. But the edges are blurring in terms of what we do and how we do. And I think that there are lots of opportunities for change, but what I hope we do have is somewhat of not only self-interest among ourselves, but interest in each other's success, so that we can create a healthy, sustainable ecosystem in the long term. So having said that, in the ecosystem, we can look at element ratios, what elemental parts of the system can change and yet still remain in good health. How much can we change? And when does more change create problems for other elements in the ecosystem. And I don't know that that's fully been explored yet from an ecosystem perspective. So in our environment, we have funding, and sustainability is something we want to be concerned about in this environment. And I'm talking about the total amount of funding. And Jeff Mackey-Mason at the University of Michigan indicates that actually the scholarly communication system has stayed relatively stable in terms of the total amount of financial resources that are in that system. And how it's been exchanged has varied over time. Intellectual property and ownership, actually, I think important for some, not so important for others. I think people will choose whether to participate in the system or not based on their perceptions of their intellectual property, their ownership, what they want out of that ownership. I'm talking about people who want ownership for recognition and people who want ownership because they want to sell something. And I've seen a growth in the second group of people within academia. I've seen academic institutions chase dollars. We've seen academic institutions build tech transfer and offices and intellectual property offices, and not many of them are deriving the benefits from having those offices in place. So I think there are better ways than every individual institution going ahead and doing its own thing, but we're not quite there yet. But intellectual property gets fuzzy also in this environment. Access is important for us to maintain, and if we don't maintain access, and we need immediate access and long-term access, access for readers and access for researchers. And as I say, in a minute I'll mention that they are not, while they're related populations, they're not the same population. Validation is very, very important to any communication now, especially in this very noisy environment of data and available content. Is getting very noisy, so authentication and validation becomes increasingly important. Provenance, I think, is also becoming important as knowing the legitimacy of a piece of content, understanding where it comes from, who it came from, how it's being maintained. Is this the original document, or is this something that's been modified by others? And now we begin to build distrust into the system. We see distrust at the intellectual property end. We see distrust to some extent at the provenance or lack thereof, lack of solid provenance. And then we have the issues of compliance, notification, registration, and all these things that keep the whole thing funding. This is not complete. This is sort of my first pass. I'm going to have a few goes round, but my first pass. And this is something that hopefully I'd like to see developed over time. We also look at where and how fast elements move in a system, so that if we move quickly, we may preserve the system too much. In closed systems, inputs and outputs are relatively negligible, and compared with internal changes. So, we'll see, we can grow things inter area, and we don't worry too much about the environment into which we house that system. But in an open system, there are inputs and outputs as well as internal cycling of elements, and we need to understand that. So the key issue then is how long, on average, an element remains within the system before it leaves it. And so we need to know that, such as funding. Is funding in the system for how long? What can we do? Is it placed in the best way? The knowledge stewardship of our knowledge ecosystems tended to be a relatively stable, relatively closed system until we started to see these externalities come into play. And I think that once we started to see things perturbing, like the source of the plates, the spinning plates, okay, and we've got a number of spinning plates going around. Well, after a while you start to see them wobble, and you have to do something to keep those plates spinning, or else they'll stop spinning and they'll fall off the pole. How do we do that in this environment? So, as I've indicated, many academic institutions seem to think that they can take this on by themselves. Now, I don't believe that's the case. I don't believe that we could do it for the same or less cost than the publishers can do this. That's my opinion, understanding something about publisher costs. And again, it takes us away from our core mission. But the other problem is that the audience for the recorded knowledge is much, much broader than the academic audience of producers. And so the next slide, I'm talk about a few statistics here. The first one is that more than 90% of the authors are academic researchers and scholars. Okay? More than 90% of the authors worldwide are academic researchers and authors. But the readership is much, much broader. And by the way, of the other under 10%, there's some federal researchers, of course, and then there are some corporate researchers, corporate R&D, although I think the latest number is only 3% of corporations fund any R&D themselves. So it's a very, very small piece, but an important piece nevertheless. The universe of readers is much, much broader than the universe of academics. And that's what academic institutions, we need to understand. About 75% and more of all reading is by non-academics. So there is a knowledge transfer from the academic sector to the government and corporate sector for obvious reasons. And then this is the bridge that you fulfill. If all the readers were in academic institutions, maybe we'd stand a shot at sort of saying, okay, well, let's academic institutions do this for ourselves. But we don't. And the financial implication of our wanting to do that is if we took, what do we say? I'll characterize this, not because I believe it, but I'll characterize it. We pay the authors, we pay the researchers. Well, we don't fully pay them, but we sort of pay the researchers. They write the articles, they conduct the peer review, we give away our intellectual property, or they give away their intellectual property to publishers, and then we pay the publishers to get it back. That's a sort of typical cycle that I've heard. Well, if we were to function as academic institutions only running this entire system, we would only be able to leverage the cost, the funding that's put into the system, and the subscriptions that we pay you. And given that more of the readers are outside of academia, we would not have the benefit of the subscriptions that come from those outside of academia. So it just seems to me we have, again, even as academic institutions, a somewhat limited view of the ecosystem without fully understanding the whole. And there are researchers, the economists who look at this, who've got a better understanding of the economics of the ecosystem, and we need to find ways to leverage that to be a positive so that there are incentives for us all to participate. By the way, one of the concerns that I have right now in higher education that will have an impact, and accreditation hasn't yet quite fully dealt with it, is the fact that I believe a couple of weeks ago the Chronicle of Education said for the first time ever more than 50% of the faculty at higher education institutions were adjunct faculty. Adjunct faculty typically don't do research. And this is something that the accrediting bodies are going to have to face. So I was recently up at New Hampshire State University, which has a very, very active, successful online education program, as well as a traditional on-campus program. But their online program is run very, very differently from their on-campus program. There is some overlap, a little bit of input from some of the faculty. They're the sort of subject matter experts that provide inputs. Few teach, but not very many. Most of the Southern New Hampshire U online faculty are adjuncts. Many of them teach for multiple institutions, which in traditional higher education, they have to get permission from people like me to go teach for another institution. And they don't conduct research. So if, in fact, our academic environment is going to move towards more and more part-time, teaching-only faculty, what happens to the research community? And that's something that I'm concerned about as I look at how accreditation is going to address these entities and these issues. But I do think that we need to understand the readership patterns of people and understand that there is a transfer of knowledge that can then be applied to other environments. And that's part of the purpose of the distribution, part of the purpose of the intellectual property system, to ensure that there's appropriate recognition of where the ideas came from and appropriate attribution through the system. So what's the future of our knowledge ecosystem, our the stewardship of this ecosystem. Well, I don't know if you know, but a number of years ago, Larry Wilkinson published a scenario model in Wired magazine. It's sort of an interesting model. And he says, given the impossibility of knowing exactly how the future is going to play out, a good strategy would be to prepare for several different possible futures and find ways that sort of, I would say if we had 4 feet, put feet into different possible futures, but be ready to maneuver in a fairly agile way. So looking at scenarios is quite interesting. And he gave the basis of a scenario model where he said it's interesting about how society is going to evolve. Is it going to evolve to more of an individual focus or to more of a community focus? So, and then he said, well, neither will ever completely disappear, but the question as to which will become the prevailing influence in society is going to be important to us. And that has happened if we look at things over time. You know, we've seen a lot of individual research. We've now seen a push towards collaborative research, for example, interdisciplinary research. We look at academic institutions functioning independently. We now look at consortia. We look at the libraries functioning independently and now functioning through consortia, et cetera, et cetera. Publishers working together on some very interesting projects these days, by the way. And so where are we? Is it individual or community? That's one dimension of the model. And similarly, if we look at knowledge, we could say in that environment, is knowledge perceived as a market good or as a common good? And there's a theory in management, I don't know if you've come across, there's an agency theory which tends to say we're driven by transactions, we're driven to optimize the outcome in terms of profit. And I'm not saying that because publishers are in the room, but just generally we want to profit. Or there's another theory, and it's called stewardship theory, that says we're not necessarily driving for a financial gain or a single outcome, but more of a societal benefit. And to some extent, we can see sort of knowledge moving from along an axis of this scenario model from a market good to a common good. And the issue is, where will we be? How will we perceive as knowledge? What's best for the ecosystem? And then the other dimension, or the vertical dimension of the framework is, again, coherence or fragmentation. Will social and political structures provide coherence, or will they fragment and break apart? Interestingly, in Europe, the European collective together has been able to do some things. When I left Europe, there wasn't much funding for research in Europe, and many of my colleagues were conducting what was called desk research. That was the research that they were conducting. I came to the United States because there was funding for research, substantial funding within federal agencies. And then the European Union cohered and started to develop their frameworks and putting large-scale resources into research activities in a sort of coherent way. So again, where on that axis will we actually end up? Are we going to move towards more coherence? Are we beginning to see more fragmentation? And how does that change the way we perceive our ability to retain a stable infrastructure or sustainable infrastructure? And so we have, along those lines, we have the control, individual knowledge control to organizational knowledge control. And again, I think the democratization of content through the World Wide Web, not necessarily peer-reviewed content, but the democratization has pushed individuals down to a little bit towards knowledge control and the development of many, many more different types of collated and value-added services, and less top-down control of the environment. So if we put them together, this sort of coherence and fragmentation, individual versus community, he came up with these 4 different sort of societal options. The first one is consumer land, where individual desires meet a social and corporate center. Everyone's a consumer. Large organizations lay down rules focused on serving consumers. The second box is the I will, where individualism meets fragmentary or marginal control by large organizations. And loyalty is to oneself, to one's own capability. There was talk sometime that we'll all market ourselves by our competencies. That's a sort of competency-based approach. We gather competencies, gather badges, that's the current term in higher education, and we'll go market ourselves with the collective set of competencies that we have. Number 3 is ectopia, widely shared stewardship values, voluntary individual, embracing of cohesion, cooperation, focus on organization affiliation as a supporter of personal values. We see that to some extent. Some organizations function in that way. And then box number 4 are the new civics. Values are shared, but in many small competing groups focused around shared disciplinary interests, emphasis on community with no big brother. And we go back and forth. So the issue would be, in this environment, can we prepare ourselves to function in any and perhaps all of those environments? So that's the best scenario to work across all. I know it's hard to do, but if we understand what they are, we might choose where we wish to play and how. So thinking about the characteristics of a potential solution, we would want stewardship that rewards researchers for research that is rigorous, high quality, etc. We want to do that. We don't want to downgrade the quality of the research that's being done. And we have a role there, you have a role there. We want to promote quality research by aligning the interests of researchers with the common good to some extent. So it's not all, you do this, you hang on to it for 20 years, don't let anybody know what you've done, and then maybe you'll have time to produce something. Those, again, I'm over-characterizing, but those opinions exist in some fields. Interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary research, more than individual research, we're beginning to see evolve in an interesting way. Not that we've eliminated individual research, but we're seeing more interdisciplinary, and the funding bodies also looking at more collaborative research between institutions, between researchers in different disciplines, between academic researchers and external researchers, and internationally, people from other countries. So those would be switches that we could move up and down that dimension. And then on the horizontal dimension, we have, we need to have stewardship that creates a funding model for funding research review, crowdsourced maybe, and distribution that allows readers to access research easily without additional funding or location barriers, allows researchers to share their results easily and inexpensively, and rewards researchers for undertaking research that's innovative and imaginative and taking risks. We've had lots of discussions in federal funding cycles about how to do that. There's a concern that traditional peer review on its own is not sufficient to allow for the out-of-the-box thinking because of the way peer review is conducted. And it's something I don't know how you deal with that in the publishing environment, whether you have a different approach to peer review or looking at something that's a little bit out of the box. A possible collaborative process. The first thing we would have to do in the ecosystem is get the players together and agree on the top-line value and need, which probably is that we want this overall process of knowledge creation, sharing, preservation, all its elements to function effectively and sustainably, with roles that incent us to keep this going. That's the key. Then we want to identify each participant's top-line value and or need in those roles, so maintaining each element in the ecosystem. Or decide we don't need it. And that's the other thing. We could decide we don't need something. And so we produce a sort of kind of value. I'm not going into the detail. I don't have all the answers. I'm hoping that we can engage the elements in a sort of collaborative discussion. And then we need to commit to meeting and protecting the ecosystem and each participant's top-line values and needs. We may not all get everything we want. We may all have to give something up. But if the whole allows us then to be more sustainable, then perhaps the way we go. And this creates a collaborative environment of trust. And trust becomes absolutely essential to a collaborative process of stewarding the ecosystem. So trust is very, very essential. And then for each participant, let's find a way in which they can contribute to the success of those top-line values and meet their own needs. So we have a strategy. We have the value and need. We have the strategy. So I'm going to. This should have been my. This could have been my subtitle: "How to Cook and Educate Your Kids Without Killing a Tiger." So I'll tell you a brief story, and then I'll be finished. So about 6 hours south of New Delhi in India is the Ranthambore National Park in Rajasthan. The park serves as the habitat for a rare tiger population. Many people come to visit India generally, and to this national forest in particular, to see and study tigers. And in so doing, they bring money into the country and to the villages around the park. The tiger is also the national animal of India, and tigers figure prominently in Indian folklore, art, and traditions. The tiger has lost 92% of its habitat, and its population has shrunk from 100,000 to about 3,000 in the last 100 years. And so there's significant concern, especially in India, that these magnificent animals will soon be extinct in the wild. But numerous problems were threatening the particular ecosystem supporting these tigers. First of all, local farmers were going into the jungle to cut down trees for firewood. And as the villagers cut down trees, the forest started to recede. And this not only reduced the size of the tigers' habitat, but it also eliminated much of their food supply, like monkeys that used to live in the trees that are now gone. So the monkeys had left the area. The cleared areas then gave farmers easier access to the jungle. So they would send their cows into the edges of the jungle to graze. The hungry tigers found themselves in the proximity of the cows, and guess what? Tigers being tigers and cows being cows, the tigers killed and ate the cows. Other villagers needed money to send their children to school, and though it was illegal to hunt tigers, one tiger pelt could pay for a year's schooling for a whole family of children. So poaching was increasing, further decreasing the tiger population. The farmers were angry that the tigers were eating their cows. So when the poachers headed into the jungle, they just simply looked the other way. They were glad to have the tigers out of the way. They wanted to protect their cows. The National Park steward, trying his best to steward this important national resource of tigers, put up large barriers between the villages and the park. He thought that would keep the tigers where the tigers needed to be, keep the cows and the poachers where they needed to be. But the villagers and the poachers simply climbed over or broke down the fences. The park rangers, the government, the villagers, and the poachers were in a constant state of conflict and distrust, and more tigers were being killed. Then the steward's son, he's a long name, let's call him Dr. Ranthambore, eventually inherited oversight of the park, and he decided there needed to be a radically different approach if the tiger ecosystem was to be saved. So the first thing he did was he tore down the fences and he sold the materials that had been used to build the fences. He assigned most of the park patrol rangers to new projects, and he instituted a new tax for tourists coming into the area. Once he'd accumulated some funds, the first thing he did was to set up a medical clinic for the villagers and the poachers to improve the health of the community generally, to get to know the people, and to build up trust and goodwill between the park staff and people living in the area. Then he worked with the villagers to breed cows that gave more milk with less feed, thus decreasing the need for extensive grazing land. And then he suggested to the farmers that instead of cutting down trees for fuel, they collect cow manure and use biogas units to transform it into fertilizer and fuel. Farmers could keep the cows closer to home, fertilize their land so it would grow better feed, not have to venture into the jungle where there were tigers, and stop cutting down and dragging trees back to their village. Then Dr. Ranthambore worked to plant new trees and assigned each tree to a villager. If they could keep their assigned tree alive, he would pay them, and he paid them more each year the longer the tree survived, so there's incentive to keep the trees going. Then the steward offered the poachers free schooling for their children if they stopped poaching, and then he gave them camels to create income from the milk and to use for transportation for themselves and for tourists. You know, tourists love camels, right? Who wants to ride a camel? Over the course of a few years, the area's ecosystem was transformed. The farmers stopped cutting down trees and instead were contributing to reforesting the jungle. The cows stayed in the village out of the way of the tigers. The poachers had their children in school and had a new livelihood. And the tiger population started climbing again, increasing tourism and general foreign investment in the area. So there are ways to take a look at an existing ecosystem, and there are ways to find what is important to the individual participants in the ecosystem and to find ways to move forward. Now it takes a lot because our ecosystem is very, very complex. I mean, I won't deny that, and it's getting more complex all the time. But if we could find a way to get the discussion going with representative samples, I'm finished, with representative samples, then maybe we could begin to make some progress. So I leave you with these three quotes. The first thing we have to do is we have to agree to where we want to be, where we're all going. So a boat doesn't go forward if each one's rowing his or her own way. The second one is it's going to take time. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. And the third thing is that we have to find constructive rather than destructive solutions. So conflict is inevitable, it's going to happen, but combat is optional. And so we need to, I think, as we go forward, think about ways in which we can work together in a more collaborative, truly collaborative stewardship way. So thank you very much.